For 8 summers, my parents packed my life into a canvas duffel bag and dropped me at my aunt's antique shop, just so my brother could have the perfect family vacations. My name is Elena. I am 28 years old now, and I run my own business restoring historical photographs. I spend my days fixing other people's broken memories. It took me a long time to realize that you cannot restore a picture if the original was completely blank to begin with. To understand how a family learns to erase a child, you have to look at how they worship the other one. My brother Julian is 4 years older than me. When he was 6, he developed severe, unpredictable asthma. I have no memory of the worst nights. The hospital runs, the blue lips, the sheer panic that hijacked my parents' nervous systems. But I grew up in the shadow of that panic. Julian was fragile. Julian was a miracle. Julian needed pristine air, constant attention, and eventually, expensive European retreats to strengthen his lungs. I was healthy. I was quiet. And in my mother's eyes, health meant I required absolutely nothing. I was the low-maintenance appliance in the corner of the room. The vacation started when I was 10. I remember the timeline perfectly because children who are ignored become brilliant detectives. By March of every year, the glossy travel brochures would appear in the recycling bin. Paris, the Swiss Alps, Maui. My mother would leave browser tabs open on the computer showing 5-star resorts. In April, the shopping bags would arrive. A new snowboarding jacket for Julian, designer sunglasses for my father, a silk evening wrap for my mother. They planned these escapes for 3 entire months. 90 days of knowing they were leaving the country. 90 days of staring at me across the dinner table, asking me to pass the salt, knowing I was not included in the itinerary. They never told me until the 2nd week of June. It was always a Tuesday. My mother would pull the olive green canvas duffel bag from the hall closet. She would pack 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of t-shirts, and my toothbrush. Then, the 4 of us would get into the sedan. We would drive north for 4 hours until the roads grew narrow and the trees closed in. We would pull up to my Aunt Beatrice's antique shop in Vermont. My father would carry the duffel bag up the wooden steps. My mother would bend down, give me a quick, sterile kiss on the cheek, and deliver the exact same line every single year. "You are our strong girl. Elena, be good for Beatrice." Then they would get back in the car. The tires would crunch on the gravel, and they would drive away toward the airport. Bound for a world I was not allowed to see. I never cried on that porch. I never screamed. I just watched the taillights disappear. I was a professional at not making a fuss. A week later, the postcard would arrive. It would get tacked to the corkboard in Beatrice's kitchen. My mother had a habit of sending these bright, glossy images that felt more like a taunt than a greeting. The contrast was a physical weight. On one side of the family, there was Julian. Julian standing on a sparkling white glacier in Switzerland, smiling behind polarized goggles. The sun bouncing off the snow in a blinding flash of privilege. Julian surfing in Hawaii, surrounded by turquoise water and white sand. On the other side of the family, there was me. I was sitting on a wooden stool in the back room of a Vermont antique shop. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of aging paper, cracked leather, and binding glue. While Julian breathed the crisp alpine air, I breathed the dust of forgotten books. I used to stare at those postcards for hours. I read the words on the back over and over, "Wish you were here." The handwriting was always rushed. The sentiment was entirely hollow. If they actually wished I was there, they would not have bought the duffel bag. I did not understand it then, but those 8 summers were a training ground. My parents were teaching me how to survive without them. They were showing me, year after year, that I was an accessory. They thought they were raising a compliant daughter who would always stay out of the way. They had no idea they were building the exact person who would eventually tear their perfect image apart. The breaking point did not happen in Vermont. It happened on a high school football field in late May. I was 18 years old. It was the day of my graduation. I sat in a sea of metal folding chairs under a punishing morning sun. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and cheap hairspray. All around me, classmates were scanning the crowded bleachers for their families. I had spent 4 years quietly building an academic record that no one in my house ever asked to see. I did not expect a grand celebration, but I expected them to stay until my name was called. My parents were in the bleachers. I spotted them when we first marched onto the field. My mother wore a floral dress. My father used a folded program to block the sun. For a brief moment, I felt a foolish flicker of hope. But 45 minutes into the ceremony, right as the principal started calling names in the middle of the alphabet, I looked up. My mother was standing. She was smoothing wrinkles out of her skirt. My father was already looking at his watch. My mother caught my eye from 50 feet away. She gave me a small, tight smile. She pointed to her wrist, and then she mouthed the words, "Julian's dinner." Julian had just been promoted to junior vice president at his corporate firm. His celebration dinner was booked for 6 o'clock. The restaurant was expensive and traffic was going to be heavy. So my parents walked down the metal bleachers, navigated through a crowd of cheering families, and exited the stadium. They did not wait to hear the name Elena Vance echo over the loudspeakers. They did not wait to see me hold the diploma I had worked 4 years to earn. When I finally walked across that stage, I shook the principal's hand. I looked out at the exact spot where they had been sitting. 2 empty spaces. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a lump in my throat. What I felt was absolute, freezing clarity. Those empty seats were not a mistake. They were a receipt. It was the final invoice for 18 years of being the invisible child. I stood on that stage and did the math. I tallied up the summer trips, the duffel bags, the postcards, and the empty chairs. The balance was 0. I owed them nothing. They had just handed me my freedom, and they did not even realize it. I walked home alone to an empty house. I did not pack the olive green canvas duffel bag. I left it shoved in the back of the hall closet. Instead, I went to my bedroom and pulled out the old wooden trunk at the foot of my bed. For 3 years, I had worked part-time at a diner. Every cash tip I made went straight into a hidden slit I had carefully cut into the canvas lining of that trunk. I sliced the lining all the way open with a box cutter. I pulled out thick, rubber-banded stacks of $20 bills. It was just over $4,000. It was enough to buy a used car and a few months of absolute silence. By 2 o'clock in the morning, my bags were loaded into the trunk of a battered sedan I bought from a mechanic down the street. I left no note on the kitchen counter. A note implies you want to be found. A note is the beginning of a negotiation. I was completely done negotiating my right to exist. I rolled down the driveway with my headlights off. I did not turn them on until I reached the end of the block. I drove to a desolate gas station on the edge of the county line. I took my phone apart. I pulled out the SIM card, broke it in half, and dropped it into a metal trash can. I bought a prepaid phone with cash. I got back into the car, put it in drive, and pointed the steering wheel west. I vanished completely. Nobody knew if I was in another state or another country. But what my parents did when the police finally knocked on my door 4 years later, that's the part that changed everything. If you've ever had to walk away to save yourself, drop a comment below. Now, let me tell you about the officer at my door. The police officer who knocked on my door 11 days after I arrived in Oregon was young, polite, and visibly bored. 11 days. I had parked my car in a state I had never visited, 2,000 miles from the high school bleachers where my parents had left me. My mother had filed a missing person report back east. She assumed the system would drag me back by my collar. She severely underestimated the law. I handed the young deputy my brand new Oregon driver's license and my apartment lease. He looked at the documents, looked at me, and asked the only question that actually mattered. "Are you here of your own free will, ma'am?" I looked him dead in the eye and said yes. He had me sign a simple paper confirming I was a voluntary missing adult. He recited the rules in a flat, practiced voice. "Your family will be notified that you are safe. They will not be told where you are. Have a good night." That was the whole miracle. A legal steel curtain dropped heavily between me and my past. I locked the door and took my first real breath. I chose Oregon because it felt like the edge of the world. It was a Pacific Northwest town wrapped in green pines and constant, quiet rain. I rented a small studio apartment over a detached garage that cost almost nothing. I needed a job immediately. I did not have a college degree, but I had something significantly better. I had the 8 summers I spent in Aunt Beatrice's antique shop. She had taught me the quiet art of handling fragile things, how to bind a cracked spine on a rare book, how to lift a century-old photograph without letting the natural oils from my skin ruin the emulsion. I walked straight into the county historical archive and asked for a job. The director looked at my age and let out a soft laugh. He told me they did not hire teenagers. So, I reached into his discard pile, pulled out a water-damaged marriage certificate from 1904, and asked for a desk. I spent 2 hours stabilizing the document right in front of him. I started work the very next Monday, for 2 years. I worked in the basement of that archive. I earned $12 an hour and I saved 10 of it. But working for someone else was never the final plan. I wanted my own ground. I found a vacant storefront on a quiet side street. It had scuffed pine floors and a drafty front window, but the natural light was absolutely perfect. I signed a commercial lease and opened Vance Historical Restoration. The work came slowly at first, but then word spread. Widows brought me torn wedding photos of their late husbands. Grandparents brought me faded silver gelatin prints of their own parents. The smell of binding glue and aged paper became my perfume. I spent my early 20s sitting under a bright magnifying lamp with a fine-tipped brush and a surgical scalpel. I fixed other people's broken family trees. I erased the water stains. I smoothed the creases. I gave them back their perfect memories. The irony was heavy, and I knew it. Every single day, I healed the past for absolute strangers. Yet, in the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk, I kept a small wooden cigar box. Inside that box were the glossy postcards my mother had sent me during all those summers she abandoned me. The ski trips to the Swiss Alps, the beaches in Maui. Wish you were here. I never threw them away, but I never restored them either. I let the edges fray. I let the bright ink fade under the fluorescent lights. Some memories simply do not deserve to be preserved. Some histories are better left decaying in a dark, locked drawer. Living brilliantly does not mean living easily. It means owning every single consequence of your own life. My first winter in the studio. A freezing storm moved through the valley. The old copper pipe under my utility sink burst in the middle of the night. Freezing water flooded the floorboards inches away from my drying racks. A normal 19-year-old might have panicked. A girl raised to be the center of the universe would have called her father crying. I did not call anyone. I found the main valve and shut off the water. I went to the library, watched an instructional video on plumbing, and bought a pipe cutter with cash. I spent 4 hours on my back on the freezing wet floor, my tongue clamped between my teeth, fusing the copper pipe myself. When I turned the main valve back on and the pipe held firm, I sat on the wet wood and smiled. It was not just thrift, it was doctrine. I was entirely self-sufficient. I did not need a golden brother. I did not need a mother who treated me like a silent appliance. By the time I turned 22, my studio was thriving, but a lease is just a borrowed room. I wanted to own the dirt beneath my feet. The landlord was an older man looking to retire. He offered to sell me the commercial space for $120,000. He wanted a $40,000 down payment. I taped a large piece of graph paper to the wall next to my desk. I wrote $40,000 at the top in thick black marker. Below it, I tracked every single dollar, overtime hours, meals I skipped, boots I resold instead of throwing away, winter coats I patched myself. I watched the number slowly climb, 10,000, 20,000, 35,000. Every box I filled in on that graph paper was another brick keeping me safe. I was building a financial fortress from nothing. I was not the invisible girl on the porch anymore. I was Elena Vance, and I was exactly 1 month away from owning my own empire. I was exactly 30 days away from signing the commercial deed. 30 days away from locking down my future. But anonymity is a fragile thing in a digital world. You can hide your address, change your phone number, and sever every physical tie you have. But you cannot control the algorithm. A young college student walked into my shop on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He ran a popular social media page focused on the forgotten history of the Pacific Northwest. He brought in a shattered glass plate negative from the American Civil War, hoping I could salvage it. I told him I could. He asked if he could record a short video of the restoration process for his page. I agreed, thinking nothing of it. I assumed a few hundred local history buffs would watch it and move on. I kept my head down, focusing the magnifying lamp, my hands carefully piecing together the uniform of a soldier dead for a century. He posted a 90-second clip that evening. He tagged the name of my studio and the city. People were fascinated by the silence of the work, the precision, the slow reveal of a face from the past. By Saturday morning, that video had 3 million views. 2,000 miles away, in a sprawling, meticulously decorated living room, my sister-in-law, Chloe, was looking at her phone. Chloe was Julian's wife. She was a woman who spent her entire existence curating the perfect aesthetic for the internet. The algorithm, in a twist of absolute cruelty, served her a viral video about vintage photography. She watched the video. She saw the side of my face. She saw the painted letters on my front window. Vance Historical Restoration. Chloe dropped her coffee mug on her expensive rug and screamed for Julian. Within 24 hours, the protective fortress I had spent 4 years building was compromised. My mother finally had my exact coordinates on a map. They arrived on a Tuesday morning. The brass bell above my door chimed, cutting through the quiet hum of the dehumidifier. I was hunched over a work table, expecting the mail carrier. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked up. My mother and father were standing in the middle of my floor. The shock was a physical blow to my chest. 4 years of absolute silence. 4 years of assuming I was permanently erased from their narrative. And suddenly they were breathing the air in my sanctuary. My father looked terribly frail. He was leaning heavily on an aluminum cane, his left side sagging, his arm resting awkwardly against his waist. My mother stood slightly in front of him, wearing a pristine beige trench coat that looked absurdly out of place among the dust and the aging paper. She did not drop her purse. She did not rush forward to pull me into a hug. She did not shed a single tear of relief that her missing daughter was alive and safe. Instead, she performed a slow, calculating sweep of the room. She looked at the drying racks, the chemical baths, the exposed brick walls, and my paint-stained boots. She took the measure of my entire independent existence. Then she looked me directly in the eye, her lips pressed into a tight, disapproving line. "So this is what you left your family for?" That was her opening sentence. No apology, no questions about my well-being, just an immediate, crushing judgment. I did not panic. The girl who used to silently pack her duffel bag was gone. I walked over to the break counter, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and set them on a small table. I invited them to sit. My mother sat down and immediately took control of the room, speaking in the low, hushed tone she used during church sermons. She laid out the situation like a manager assigning shifts. My father had suffered a massive stroke in February. The hospital bills were astronomical. He required intense, continuous physical rehabilitation and round-the-clock supervision. He could not drive. He could barely walk up a flight of stairs. Then came the justification. Julian was a senior vice president now. Julian was traveling constantly for corporate mergers. Julian and Chloe had a toddler at home. They simply could not be burdened with the daily, exhausting reality of medical care. Their lives were too important, too full, too perfect to be disrupted by illness. And then, my mother delivered the verdict she had traveled 2,000 miles to hand down. She looked at my successful business, the one I had built from absolute scratch with my own cracked hands. She told me I needed to list the lease for sale immediately. She told me to pack my apartment, drive back to Ohio, and move into my childhood bedroom. I was going to become my father's full-time, unpaid caregiver. Her logic was flawless in its cruelty. I was the strong one. I was the easy one. I was single. I did not have a husband or a child, which meant, in her eyes, my time and my ambitions were completely disposable. I was just the spare part, kept in storage, ready to be activated the moment the golden child could not handle the pressure. I stood there holding a fragile photograph from 1912, while the woman who threw me away tried to overwrite my future. Have you ever been told your boundaries are just you being selfish? Let me know in the comments. Because my response was about to set the whole family on fire. After my mother delivered her impossible demand, calling my hard-earned boundaries selfish, the silence in my studio was deafening. I looked at her, standing there in her pristine beige trench coat, expecting me to fold like a cheap lawn chair. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply walked over to the front door, pulled it open, and told them visiting hours were over. I told them I had a business to run, a life to live, and that they needed to leave my property immediately. The look on my mother's face was a mixture of absolute shock and wounded pride. She was not used to being denied. They walked out into the cold Oregon rain, and I locked the heavy brass deadbolt behind them. I leaned against the cool glass. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a quiet, vibrating rage. I needed an anchor. I walked back to my desk, picked up my phone, and dialed the only person who had ever actually felt like family, Aunt Beatrice. She answered on the second ring. The familiar, comforting sound of the bell on her antique shop door chimed in the background. I did not even say hello. I just said, "They found me." They were just here. I heard her breath catch. For a long moment, the only sound on the line was the static of a phone signal stretching across 2,000 miles. I poured out the whole story, the viral video, the stroke, the demand that I sell my restoration studio to become an unpaid nurse while Julian lived his perfect, uninterrupted life. I expected Beatrice to be angry on my behalf. I expected her to validate my outrage, but instead, her voice cracked. It was a sound I had never heard from her before. It was the sound of a woman carrying a crushing weight that she was finally ready to put down. "Elena," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there is something I have to tell you. Something I have been holding on to for 16 years. I sat down in my heavy desk chair, gripping the wooden armrests. Beatrice took a deep breath. She took me back to the summer I was 12 years old. That was the summer my parents went to a luxury resort in Maui for 3 weeks, leaving me in Vermont with a handful of cheap t-shirts and a worn-out pair of sneakers. Beatrice told me that she did not just sit by and watch it happen. She had been building a case. For 4 years, she had quietly collected every single piece of evidence she could find. She kept copies of the travel itineraries my mother carelessly mailed to her. She kept the grocery receipts proving she was the one buying my food, my winter coats, and my school supplies. She even kept a detailed journal documenting the exact dates and times they dropped me off and picked me up, noting the total lack of phone calls in between. She was preparing to call CPS, Child Protective Services. I sat completely frozen in my chair. "You were going to turn them in?" I asked. "Why didn't you?" Beatrice started to cry. It was a quiet, heartbreaking sound that echoed through the phone receiver. She told me she took her entire box of evidence to a family law attorney in town. She laid it all out on his heavy mahogany desk and told him she wanted to sue for emergency custody. But the lawyer looked at the papers, looked at her, and shook his head. He explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of the legal system. He told her that emotional neglect, the kind of cold, calculated abandonment my parents practiced, is incredibly difficult to prove in a court of law. There were no physical bruises. There were no broken bones. My parents were wealthy, respected members of their community. If CPS investigated and actually decided the home was unfit, they would not automatically hand me over to an aunt. Beatrice was an unmarried woman in her late 50s. She ran a modest antique shop and lived in a small apartment above it. She did not have a high income or a traditional family structure. The lawyer warned her that the state would likely place me in the foster care system while the courts fought it out. "You could have been lost in that system, Elena," Beatrice told me through her tears. You could have been bounced from house to house, living with absolute strangers. I could not risk losing you to a system that did not love you." So, she made the hardest choice of her life. She chose to swallow her pride. She chose to play the role of the compliant, slightly eccentric aunt. She chose to smile at my mother on the porch every single June, biting her tongue until it bled, just to guarantee that I would have a safe place to sleep for those 2 months. She let my parents believe she was just a passive bystander. She let me believe she was too weak to stand up for me. She sacrificed her own dignity just so she could be my permanent shield. I sat in my studio, looking at the fragile, century-old photographs on my desk, with tears finally streaming down my face. All those years, I thought I was entirely alone. I thought I was just a piece of luggage being passed around. I thought no one in the world was fighting for me. But she fought for me in the only way she could. Motherhood is not about blood. It is not about who brings you into the world or who sends you glossy postcards from across the ocean. Motherhood is about the person who is willing to look like the villain, the person who will stand quietly in the background, just to keep you safe in the dark. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and told Beatrice about the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner my parents had demanded I attend. I was not going to run and hide anymore. I was going to face them, and I was going to finish what Beatrice started. I booked a red-eye flight to the Midwest for the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I did not pack a standard suitcase. I went to the back of my closet and pulled out the old, olive green canvas duffel bag, the exact same bag they had used to ship me away for 8 summers. It was frayed at the edges and smelled faintly of old attic dust, but the heavy brass zipper still worked perfectly. Carrying it through the airport felt like carrying a ghost. But I was no longer the frightened 18-year-old girl who had run away in the middle of the night. I was a business owner. I was a woman who restored history for a living, and I was flying back to dismantle my own. That bag was not just luggage. It was evidence. When I pulled my rental car into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as the day I left it. A pristine 2-story colonial with manicured hedges. It was the kind of house that lied to the street, projecting an image of absolute warmth. I walked up the concrete steps, the canvas strap digging familiar grooves into my shoulder. My mother opened the door before I could even ring the bell. She was wearing a tailored burgundy dress, a string of pearls around her neck, and her signature church smile. She looked at me, and her eyes dropped immediately to the old green duffel bag. A tiny muscle twitched in her jaw, but she quickly recovered. She ushered me inside, playing the role of the gracious host. acting as if we had not just had a quiet, bitter war in my studio 2 weeks prior. The house was packed. 12 people were crowded into the living room and kitchen. The air was heavy with the smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon candles. My mother had invited the full cast of characters for her performance. Extended cousins, wealthy neighbors, and relatives who only ever showed up for a spectacle. They all turned to look at me when I walked into the foyer. I walked through the room, nodding politely. An older cousin patted my arm and told me I looked tired, a passive-aggressive compliment disguised as family concern. Every face in that room reminded me of Aunt Beatrice, sitting alone in her antique shop, carrying the burden of my safety because these people were too obsessed with appearances to ever protect a child. Then I saw Julian. My older brother was standing by the stone fireplace, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. He was wearing a cashmere sweater, completely untouched by the medical crisis our family was facing. He was telling a neighbor about his latest corporate merger, laughing loudly, his chest puffed out with self-importance. His wife, Chloe, was sitting on the velvet sofa next to him, entirely absorbed in her phone screen. They were the absolute picture of untouched privilege, the golden family, perfectly insulated from reality. In the corner of the living room, sitting in a heavy leather recliner, was my father. The sight of him physically stopped me in my tracks. The man I remembered was distant and passive, but always physically imposing. Now, he looked incredibly frail. The stroke had aged him 10 years. His left arm rested limply on a pillow, and his mouth pulled down slightly on one side. When he looked at me, there was no authority left. There was only a quiet, desperate helplessness. He was trapped inside his own failing body, sitting in a room full of people pretending everything was perfectly fine. He gave me a slow, trembling nod. I nodded back, feeling a strange mix of pity and detachment. At 4 o'clock, my mother announced dinner was ready. The dining room table was expanded with 2 extra leaves. It was set with her best floral china and heavy silver cutlery. We took our seats. I was placed near the middle, directly across from Julian and Chloe. My father was wheeled to the head of the table, while my mother stood at the opposite end, presiding over her domain. I ate quietly, waiting. I knew my mother too well. She did not invite this many people to a holiday dinner without planning a theatrical performance. She needed an audience to validate her reality. Right as the dessert plates were being cleared, my mother picked up a silver spoon. She tapped it gently against her crystal wine glass. A sharp, ringing sound echoed through the dining room. Every conversation stopped immediately. All eyes turned to her. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her burgundy dress. She looked around the table, her eyes shining with manufactured emotion. "Before we serve the pie," she began, her voice perfectly modulated, "I have some very important family news to share. As all of you know, this has been a terribly difficult year for us. Arthur's stroke was a shock to our entire family. We have been praying for a solution, a way to make sure he gets the round-the-clock care he needs without putting an unfair burden on Julian, who works so hard to provide for his own beautiful family." Julian nodded solemnly, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Chloe finally put her phone face down on the table, looking incredibly proud. My mother turned her gaze directly to me. She smiled, a beaming, victorious smile. She honestly believed that my presence at this table meant I had surrendered. She believed the canvas duffel bag in the hallway was my white flag. "But we are so blessed," my mother continued, raising her glass slightly toward the chandelier, "because our family takes care of its own. I am so thrilled to announce that Elena has decided to sell her little business in Oregon. She is moving back home to live with us. She is going to be Arthur's full-time caregiver. She has always been our strong, reliable girl." The table erupted into a soft chorus of approval. Someone clapped their hands. The older cousin smiled at me and mouthed the words, "What a good daughter." Julian raised his glass in my direction, looking deeply relieved that his inheritance and his free weekends were completely secure. My mother stood at the head of the table, basking in the glow of her own perfectly directed scene. She had painted me into a corner in front of 12 witnesses. In her mind, if I backed out now, I would be the villain who abandoned a sick old man on a holiday. I sat perfectly still. I looked at the 12 smiling faces. I looked at Julian's smug expression. I looked at my mother's victorious posture. And I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, steady calm. The clapping faded into a self-satisfied hum around the dining room. 12 pairs of eyes rested on me, expecting the standard response. They expected the quiet, compliant girl to nod, to accept her assignment, and to politely pass the pumpkin pie. My mother remained standing at the head of the table, her hands resting on the edge of the mahogany wood, waiting for my verbal submission. She had designed this trap perfectly. In front of the wealthy cousins and neighbors, a refusal would make me a monster. I looked down at the silver fork and took a slow, deep breath. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, hard weight of a woman who had spent 4 years building her own empire from nothing. I reached down to the floor beside my chair. I unzipped my old canvas duffel bag. The zipper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, right next to the crystal gravy boat. "I am not moving back to Ohio," I said. I kept my voice low. "When you hold all the cards, you never need to shout." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My mother's victorious smile froze on her face, turning into a rigid, unnatural mask. The older cousin, the one who had just called me a good daughter, slowly lowered her water glass. "Excuse me," my mother whispered, her tone dangerously sharp. I tapped the top of the manila folder with my index finger. I told them that I had spent the last 2 weeks researching the best medical options in their county. Inside were the contracts for a premium, Medicare-approved home care agency, highly recommended by the local neurological board. They offer round-the-clock physical rehabilitation and daily nursing support. The nurses will come to this house. They will manage all of his daily medical needs. I pushed the folder slightly toward the center of the table. "The intake evaluation is already scheduled for Monday morning," I said. My mother's face flushed a deep, furious shade of red. She slammed her hands down on the table, no longer caring about her perfect hostess image. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed, glancing frantically at the wide-eyed guests. "Do you know what private care costs? We are on a fixed income. You own a successful business in Oregon. If you refuse to move home, you will pay this agency." And there it was, the ultimate entitlement. If they could not have my time and my labor, they were going to take my money. The $40,000 sitting in my account, saved by patching my own winter coats, waiting for the commercial deed on my studio. I turned my head and looked directly at Julian. Julian was staring at the folder like it was a live explosive. He had stopped sipping his expensive bourbon. Chloe was staring at me, her mouth slightly open. "I am not paying a single dime," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my brother. My mother gasped. "You ungrateful child," she started to yell, but I cut her off. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute ice in my tone forced her to stop. I looked at Julian and laid out the exact arithmetic of our childhood. You got the vacations, you got the private schools, you got the European tours. You are the investment. Now it is time for the return on investment. Sell the vacation home. Julian. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He looked at his wife, then at his plate. He did not say a word. I leaned forward slightly. Our parents poured every financial resource into making your life absolutely perfect. They shipped me away every summer so they could afford your lifestyle. I was just the invisible spare part. Well, the spare part is no longer available. You are the primary asset. I pointed to the folder on the table. You are going to pay for the nurses. Julian, I told him, you are a senior vice president. Liquidate your stock options. Take care of the people who sacrificed their other child to give you everything. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His face was pale. Chloe looked absolutely horrified, realizing for the first time that the family wealth she married into was built on my erasure. My mother started to cry. Not tears of sadness, but tears of pure, unadulterated humiliation. The 12 guests were staring at her, whispering, realizing that the perfect family image was a complete fabrication. I watched the illusion dissolve right before my eyes. The mask had shattered, right in the middle of her pristine dining room. I stood up from my chair. I picked up the old olive green duffel bag and slung it over my shoulder. I told the table that my flight back to Oregon left in 3 hours. I told them that I had a meeting with a commercial real estate broker on Monday morning to sign the deed for my historical restoration studio. I was paying the $40,000 down payment in full, with my own money, to secure my own future. I am leaving now, I said, and I am never coming back to this table. I turned my back on the dining room and walked out. I did not wait to hear if Julian started yelling or if my mother collapsed into a theatrical fit of tears. I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the front door, the canvas strap of my duffel bag cutting into my shoulder. The air in that house suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the sheer force of the truth. Right as I reached for the brass handle of the front door, I heard the uneven, dragging sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around. My father was standing in the shadows of the foyer. He was leaning heavily on his aluminum cane, his breathing shallow and labored. He did not say a word. He knew better than to speak. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his gray trousers with his good hand. His fingers were trembling violently as he held out a small, folded piece of paper. I took it from him. The paper was yellowed and stiff. I unfolded it under the dim light of the entryway chandelier. It was an invoice. The letterhead belonged to a private investigation firm based out of Chicago. The date stamped at the top was exactly 4 months after I had disappeared on the night of my high school graduation. The investigator had billed my father for 60 hours of skip tracing and background searches. At the very bottom of the invoice, written in my father's messy, slanted handwriting, were 2 short sentences. Located her in Oregon. Margaret said to cancel the contract and let her fail, so she will come crawling back. I stood there staring at the blue ink. For 4 entire years, I believed that absolutely no one in this house had even bothered to look for me. I believed my absence was completely accepted without a single question. But my father had looked. He had paid a stranger to find me. He knew I was in Oregon. He just did not have the spine to stand up to my mother and bring me home. He looked at me, his eyes watering, his mouth pulled down by the stroke and the suffocating weight of his own regret. He was silently begging for absolution. I looked at this broken, quiet man. And in that exact moment, the last heavy chain tying me to my childhood completely snapped. I forgave him. I truly did. I forgave his weakness. I forgave his silence. I forgave his inability to protect me. I reached out and gently squeezed his good shoulder. But forgiving someone in your heart does not mean you have to surrender your life to fix their mistakes. I am okay, Dad, I whispered. And you are going to be okay, too. Julian will handle it. I opened the front door, stepped out into the freezing November air, and closed the door behind me. I did not look back. My flight landed in Oregon late the next afternoon. The moment I walked out of the terminal, the cold, damp Pacific Northwest rain hit my face, and I took my first real breath in 3 days. I went straight to my bank on Monday morning. I sat in a leather chair across from a teller and asked for a cashier's check. I watched her print the numbers. $40,000. It was every skipped meal, every repaired winter coat, every lonely holiday wrapped up into a single piece of paper. At noon, I walked into the commercial real estate broker's office. I slid that check across a heavy glass table. I picked up a black ink pen and signed my name on the bottom line of the property deed. The stroke of that pen was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I was no longer a tenant in someone else's world. I owned the dirt beneath my feet. I owned the brick walls of my studio. I owned my own history. Fast forward exactly 1 year later. It is Thanksgiving Day again. But the scene is entirely different. I did not travel to the Midwest. Instead, I pushed 3 massive oak drafting tables together right in the middle of my restoration studio. I covered them with a heavy white linen cloth. The room smells of roasted turkey, fresh sage, and the faint, permanent, comforting scent of binding glue and old paper. There are no crystal gravy boats. There are no wealthy neighbors pretending to be perfect. There are 12 mismatched chairs pulled up to the wood. Sitting in those chairs is the family I built with my own 2 hands. The young college historian who posted the video that changed my life is sitting on the left, laughing with the retired landlord who sold me this building. The widow from down the street, whose grandfather's war letters I restored, is pouring wine. And sitting right at the head of the table, in the place of absolute honor, is Aunt Beatrice. I bought her a first-class ticket to fly out for the holiday. She is wearing a beautiful emerald green sweater, her eyes bright and happy. She is not hiding in the shadows of an antique shop anymore. She is sitting exactly where a mother belongs, surrounded by warmth, respect, and deep, quiet love. I look around this room, at these beautiful, flawed, genuine people, and I finally understand the truth about family. Family isn't blood. It is not the people who share your last name, or the people who buy you a duffel bag to ship you away. Family is the people who never ask you to shrink yourself so they can feel big. It is the people who protect you when you are not in the room. I raise my glass, and the whole table raises theirs to meet mine. The sound of clinking glass echoes against the brick walls of the empire I built. If you have ever had to walk away from the table you were born at to build your own, I want you to know that I see you. Tell me about the family you chose in the comments below. Never apologize for protecting your own peace. Stay strong. Keep building your own empire. And I will see you in the next story. That clinking glass is more than just a holiday toast. It is the sound of a woman who finally stopped paying the price for someone else's perfect life. Elena's story is a heavy reminder that your savings, your peace of mind, and your golden years belong to you. You are not a backup plan. You are not a free resource for relatives who only remember your name when they need a favor, a caregiver, or a check. So many of us are taught to stay quiet as we get older. We are expected to just shrink down, hand over our hard-earned security, and play the role of the dutiful peacekeeper while others take the credit. But sometimes, the most beautiful thing you can restore is your own dignity. Now, I want to hear directly from you. Have you ever had to draw a hard financial or emotional line with family members who tried to take advantage of your kindness? Or maybe, like Elena and Aunt Beatrice, you have built your own beautiful chosen family. Go down to the comments right now and share your story. This community reads them. I read them. We draw incredible strength from each other's survival. If Elena's victory struck a chord with you today, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We have so many more stories coming up on this channel. Stories about women who refuse to be erased, who outsmart the manipulators, and who prove that the absolute best revenge is living a brilliant, unapologetic life. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will be waiting for you in the next video.